My name is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder. Today is Thursday, January 23rd, 2013, and I'm interviewing Jereldine Redcorn as part of the Oklahoma Native Artists Project, sponsored by the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. We're at Jerry and Charles's home in Norman. Jerry, you're Potawatomi and Caddo. You've spent much of your life as an educator, but in 1991 you started making Caddo pottery. Since then you've been a Rockefeller Fellow, a community scholar with the Smithsonian, and one of your pots was chosen by First Lady Michelle Obama to reside in the White House. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
You're welcome. Happy to do it.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the Indian Hospital, and I grew up mostly in Colony, Oklahoma, on cattle land, my grandmother's allotment in a farm, and that's what we did. My father was a farmer, and so we helped with farming and the animals.
So you were close to is this your mom's mother?
This is my father's allotment.
Okay.
He's Caddo, and we used to, when we were young and we were working in the fields, like chopping cotton or pulling cotton, we would find just a lot of arrowheads and a lot of artifacts and pieces of pottery. Some were pretty big, so we just kind of wonder, wow, these things were pretty old and we're seeing them. But beyond that, not really, thinking about pottery.
Right. That's amazing. What was your relationship with your grandparents on your dad's side?
I didn't know them. They had passed away before I was born. And so, no, I did not know them. And that's, to me, a real loss, because I can see my grandson growing up and just absolutely loving it, and I hope he realizes how great it is for him to know Charles and myself.
Mm-hmm. How about on your mom's side? Did you have grandparents on that side, or?
I did. My grandfather passed away before I was born, I think sometime in the 1930s, and my grandmother lived away from us. She lived in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and so I didn't see her except on very rare occasions, usually a funeral, or sometimes we would visit, but not that often, because it was about 200 miles away, and that was before that was before interstate. So it was a long trip, and with 8 children, and in a car that you hope didn't break down. It was really it was an undertaking.
So you're growing up on a farm. What are your first memories of seeing art? And maybe it was those early.
It probably was, because we would find stones that had been used. We'd find grinding stones. But on the pottery, you could see appliques, or you would see different marks. But basically, I think art was, except for songs, dances, art was in clothing. Art was in the dances that we went to, and the shawls that we'd see, and the beadwork. I have an aunt. She's a Cheyenne, and so I'd go to her house and I would watch her bead, and the things that she turned out, the purses, the moccasins, all the other articles that she was making, was what I saw. And so to me that was art. And since we were such a small school, we really didn't have the opportunity. There wasn't a museum in town. We didn't really go to any, take trips, except for sometimes we'd go to the state capitol and we'd go to the historical museum and see the murals by the Kiowa Five and and others like Archie Blackout and the Stokes, and in that I thought they were just amazing to me because I knew some of them, and they were rather old, so, and I guess, I'm older now, and then I can think about how old I thought these people were, and they were doing these things in the 30s, so most of them were still alive when I was, I guess in high school.
Where did you encounter some of the older artists whose work you?
Well, my father went to school with St. Patrick's Catholic school in Anadarko, and he was good friends with, and try to think of his name now, Vanessa's grandfather. Can't remember, but they were very good friends, and so he would invite us to a lot of their dances. And at that time, I really didn't know that what he was doing was significant. But and he didn't actually show his paintings or anything like that to us. But we would go to his every once in a while. He would have a dance at his place. Really, I guess. At Fort Cobb, and that was always interesting. And then the Stokes were from Carnegie, so Colleen and Carnegie were very close together, like maybe 15 miles apart. And so I knew a lot of the children of the Kiowa artists, and but not really thinking about them as artists. So I don't think I really had an exposure to art other than nature and the beadwork and shawls and buckskin dresses or dashtos. So that was my artistic world, and wasn't exposed exactly to, I would say, the art of opera or anything like that. But I would listen, we'd listen on radio and had our favorites. And one of the things that I thought was really cool was like learning Caddo dances, and I didn't learn the songs until much later. But when I was young, they were really a lot of fun.
So you were able to travel down that way and participate in the dances your dad did each summer?
Yes, every summer, but our allotment was a Caddo allotment, but it was on the edge of the Cheyenne Arapaho reservation and colony. And on that reservation there were, I assume, WPA houses and barns, and they were pine on the inside, knotty pine on the inside with wooden roofs, shake roofs. Okay, that's and the barns were really big. The thing about it is that we fit in because Caddos were farmers. I mean, we fit in with that scene, but the Cheyennes did not. That wasn't their. Farming was something that I think that they put aside when they found the plains and buffalo, and so my dad, we had cows and we had pigs and we had, and for a time we lived in a couple of those houses that were on the reservation, and the reason was my father had come home from the war in 1944, and when he was discharged from the Army, World War II, and when he came home, our family house, had been rented to somebody else. So for a year there, we kept our contract with them, and we lived in some of the Indian houses, some of the Cheyenne houses and Arapaho houses that they had put on the reservation. And it is kind of interesting because our neighbors were Cheyennes or Arapaho. I know just north of us was Ike Rhodes, and he was a Cheyenne, and he sang and around the drum. He was one of our singers. I say our singers, but anyway, one of the singers that Colony produced, and then just beyond that was the Manns. Henrietta Mann, who married a white man, but not her name was Henrietta Whiteman later, but I knew her, when she was a young girl. And so we went to school with the Cheyenne and Arapahoes, and because we did a lot of the customs, I know the Cheyennes had buckskin dresses, whereas the Caddos were different clothes, and their songs were different. We every Saturday night in the wintertime we would gather at the Cheyenne Arapaho Community Building. It was a really nice building with a pot-bellied stove, and the men would get there and start the fire early, and then the singers would come and warm the drum. Generally we had two singers, Ike Rhodes and an Arapaho, and if I remember his name I will get and Jasper Reynolds, that's who it was. And he was one of our neighbors too on the reservation there. They were spaced about maybe an eighth of a mile apart, and each one having a barn and a pump, and I just thought all reservations were like that, and I found out later not everyone had those houses, and so I think it was interesting. And then there was a boarding school there on the reservation. It was called Seeger Indian School, and they basically called the town Seeger Colony, and later it changed to Colony. But that's where I went to school, but that's where my father went to boarding school. Okay. And so there were a few Caddos that went there, but mostly Arapaho and some Cheyennes. I think many of the Cheyennes went to Concho. But later on the town or the tribes, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, let the town use that as their school, and so I assume they rented the buildings, and it was 2 stories, and then it had a very spacious attic, and I just thought all schools were like that, but it was really cool. I mean, I thought it was, and so that's, and most of the kids there that I went to school with, and I started 1st grade there. We moved there when I was 4 years old, and we moved from Messiah Park, which was close to Fort Bliss, and that's where my father was stationed. So we moved to Messiah Park to be near him, and then we moved to Colony, and that was when I was about 4 years old. And so I started school there, and I finished school there, and basically I guess that's my hometown. And we were about 13 miles away from the Caddo, where most of the Caddos were, which is in Binger. And so we went to dances at Binger, Caddo dances, which were different, very, very different. And then we'd go to Carnegie to go to their dances, and then we'd have dances at Colony Powwow, or we'd go to Weatherford or Clinton, for other dances. So I knew a lot of different tribes, and I knew their customs, kind of how they did things different, and I, didn't know too many Comanches, but my father did, because he had gone to Haskell Indian School when, way back in the 20s. So he knew some of the Comanches, and so we would see them at the Anadarko Fair every year. And and I'm saying that because my view of the world was of a lot of tribes with different customs, and so and of course what I loved best were the Caddo dances. They were not done generally during the evening. It was just like an all night dancing, and singing. Whereas, like, if you go to Carnegie, the dance would be over at 10, 11, and people would go home. But the Caddo people they just danced all night.
Yeah, those are wonderful influences. What is your first memory of making art?
Excuse me. My first memory of making art was at school, and there was I would never have art, but one of our teachers was an artist and an art teacher, and so for about maybe 3 years there was art at Colony, and so I think I was a freshman, and so they just combined all the grades. We weren't a big school. I'm sure there were 50 or 60 in the whole high school, and so it was pretty small. And so I had this opportunity to learn to draw and to learn, lettering, make posters, and I tried pretty hard, but I just could see that I felt like I didn't have the talent, And what's interesting about this is the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians who went to school there, they loved that class, and probably as much as they disliked all the other parts of it and all of the other, discipline parts of it, but they loved that class, and they loved the art teacher, and that was like the first time I saw those young boys really relate to a teacher or someone who was not Indian, and I know that's I think the first like white person I ever really knew was my first grade teacher, and it was interesting that, as much as I could talk now or see, I wasn't that way. I know there was just something that I just didn't relate to them, although I liked her. I liked my first grade teacher, but at the same time I would see some other kids who were just comfortable at talking to them, and it was just like, this is different. But that really was the first time I ever connected with art, and then and I was good in math, and I was good in math and English, and so I majored in math in college, and I minored in English, and those two things I think fit very well into art, and but I didn't take an art course. I wish I would have now.
I'm glad you said that, because I do have a question about the fit, and that's wonderful and unusual for number one to be majoring in math, to have a mathematical and be good at it and be encouraged, and so I was wondering how you got to Wayland University. Is that where you went to college?
I went to college at Wayland, and I was just talking about this the other night at our language class, Caddo language, and I was valedictorian of our class, and there was not any teacher or the superintendent or principal who said, "Jerry, I believe you should go to college. I'll look for a scholarship for you." It was just assumed that it was not for Indians. Otherwise, why would they not have encouraged someone who is, I think, as bright as myself, But the way I got to go was there was a preacher. His name was Stephen Gover, and he's Pawnee, and he was in Weatherford. And every once in a while, he would come to our church, and he invited me to go with him to Falls Creek, and I spent a week down there. That was a lot of fun. And so when I graduated, or before I graduated, he came to me and said, I think you could get a basketball scholarship. And at that time, I had no idea that I had never heard of Wayland College. Wayland Baptist College is what it was then. And he said, but he did know. And he said, I'm going to take you down there having basketball tryouts. And it's at Plainview, Texas. And so he drove me down there, and then I stayed in the dorm, and I tried out, and I received an academic scholarship, and then later I received a basketball, I guess work study program, So I was the secretary to the coach. And he really didn't have anything for me to do.
So he didn't really play you that much, but...
No, he didn't. So I would study and I would do things. But at that time, there were only 2 colleges in the United States that had women's basketball teams. One was Wayland Baptist University, and the other one was Iowa State. Now, Nashville Business College had one, but theirs was more like a club team, and in that when you graduated, you still, if you were working for them, you could play. So basically, to go to that, and I know it just probably sounds, OU didn't have a women's team, Moore didn't have one, Anadarko didn't, Pawhuska didn't, Tulsa. I mean, all of the big schools, but the little ones had basketball. So I really, truly enjoyed playing basketball and then getting the opportunity to actually go to college. And so really that's how I did it. Because, my parents really didn't know how. I think they went to the, they went to the education director in Anadarko agency, and said, do you have any scholarships for my daughter who's the valedictorian? And he would say, no, we didn't. But I found out later that they did. But they would push them to... Mm-hmm. Anyway, that was my first, I guess, although I didn't know about it, that was my first knowledge of like favoritism, or and they don't do that now. But I didn't get a BIA scholarship until I think I was married, and then later they changed the programs, and so it was more people had knowledge of these programs. So and then my oldest sister was valedictorian. They didn't have any money for her. She did go to Haskell and got a really good education there. And then my next sister, the second oldest, was valedictorian, and they had no money for her. And my third sister, the same thing. And for me, they had no money. But I was fortunate, I guess, that Stephen Gover took an interest in me. Otherwise, I would, probably would not have gone on to get a degree. But I would have gone to secretary school. Mm-hmm.
And we needed you in Indian education. What did you do when you got out of school? Did you meet your husband at that point?
I did. I went to the University of Oklahoma, and I got a scholarship for math. But when I got there, I really didn't have the interest. And I really wanted to write, or I was interested in English, and so I switched over to English. And I did meet Charles. I think we met at OU. And he was not going to OU at that time. He was taking, I guess, a semester off. And he had already gone, I think, the year before or 2 years before. But I met his sister. We were roommates, and so she introduced me to him, and we had, we started going out, and actually, and then we got married. So
Still not really taking any art classes or anything.
still not taking any art classes at all.
Focused on English.
But you know what? Charles' brother, Jim Redcorn, was a good artist. And that's when I started noticing art or thinking about it. And he would talk about colors, or he would talk subject matter, and I'd watch him sketch and see how he developed things, and he had a passion for art. And I know my daughter, she was a graphic artist, and she would say, you can work at being art, you can work at being better, I mean, that's what her what she was saying. But you need to take care, and you need to do it just like you would do a garden, and study and all these things. But I do think that there's talent in there and passion that comes naturally. I would watch my grandson draw, and he was drawing, at 3 and 4 and 5, and I was, and he drew a lot of like Spider-Man or things, comics, and then he would develop his style through it, and he was just young, and I said, and one day I said, how do you draw this? And he said, I'm careful. He said, I'm careful. And then if he made a mistake, or if he thought, he would look at what he was doing, he would erase it. And I thought that's what I didn't have, was the patience to be careful, and then to enjoy the patience without getting, upset with what you're doing. And I know I've seen some movies where, you would see artists like throw something across the room. I doubt it, because why would they throw paint? I mean, because it costs a lot. Or why tear up a canvas? Because that costs a lot.
When did you decide to go on to graduate school?
I was teaching math at Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, and there was a program to go to Penn State, and basically sponsored by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so both Charles and I applied to go, and I was working at the time, so it was fairly easy, because they were able to just continue. I would continue receiving my pay, and we went to Penn State, and that was really a great experience, because it was about administrative education. But in college there was not Indian studies at that time, and what I learned about Indian history was and there were the Indians, that chapter on Indians, and they were in the way of progress. So basically, they were put on reservations, and they really wanted it, because we're actually doing them a favor, because now they can they can go to school, and they can become farmers, and et cetera, et cetera. But and so you never really got history, or the real history. So when we went to Penn State, we were, education in the form of what was happening on reservations, what was happening across the nation in education, and what are some things that we could change. What is the actual legal aspects of education? And I think that was one of our course, the legal aspects of education. But I think the year when I graduated from Wayland, I was contacted by a group that had set up American Indian Workshop in Boulder, Colorado, and so I was there for 6 weeks with other, I think there were 30 Indians, and we stayed in I guess it was a fraternity house that was rented, and the girls stayed on the second floor and the men on the third, and then we had the living area in the bottom and the dining area in the basement. But it was a pretty neat setup, but learning, being taught history and anthropology. And learning about the legal things that were happening across the nation. We had some people from the National Congress of the American Indian come and give speeches, and I think that was part of opening everybody's eyes to the fact that there is the history, and there were treaties, and there were good things about Indian education that would be good for everybody, and not just Indian students.
So you went on, it's this, it all comes into play throughout your life, doesn't it? You went on and taught geometry, I guess, in the Oklahoma public schools for a while.
I did, yes.
And I'm wondering, I know we haven't gotten to your pottery yet, but does anything from your math background work into your work with clay?
Yeah, it does, and it's very helpful to know, know about angles or know proportions and things like that. That is very helpful, and then I think getting over the fear of art, the fear of drawing, and that was major.
When did you get involved with the Caddo Cultural Club? And I guess, are you and your husband living in Oklahoma City then at this point?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, we were. It was probably in 1990, maybe 91, I think. Yes, that's when it was, about 1990, I think. There was a man here in Norman, and there was another man in Oklahoma City that said they're doing these classes down in Binger, and they're practicing the dances, and I think his name was Phil Newcomen here, and his wife was Caddo, but he was so interested in he was probably more Caddo than most Caddos, because he knew the dances and the language and the customs, and so when he went down there, I would ride down there with him, and it was really interesting. I think they had a Caddo dance once, and it was over about 10 o'clock, and they said, well, why is the dance over? And it was because the only singer who knew the songs was ill, and he had to leave. And they said, this has got to change. and so that was Wimpy Edmonds, and then his brother Ranlett, who knew the songs, and there were, I think, a few more people, Fred Parton, but people had moved away. Ranlett lived at Lawrence, Kansas, because he had a job with the Haskell Indian School, before it was Haskell University. And so he didn't get back that much. And he actually, went to a lot of powwows in Lawrence or over at the Mayetta, where the Potawatomi Reservation was, or with the Kickapoos. But but living up there, he didn't have a chance to sing with other caddos. So, and that's when I became involved. And and in 1991, I believe, it was the Texas Archaeological Society was holding their, I guess they call it the archaeological dig or archaeological project. And they were holding it on the Red River on the Texas side. But there were no place for them to stay, so they crossed the Red River and they stayed at the Holiday Inn, I think, in Idabel. And they invited us to Idabel, the Culture Club, to dance and sing. And so we went down there, and while we were there, we went to the Red River Museum, and there had been a fabulous collection of Caddo pottery by excuse me, by several people, but most of all by the owners of the Red River Museum. And they let us go in the back and look at them, and it was just astonishing. And I was thinking, I can't believe I'm seeing this, and I can't believe that I did not know about this. And so it was kind of like a connection to my history, to realize the Caddos were there in Idabel. They were on the other side, and that along where Idabel is, along the Red River, both sides, there were little towns, Caddo towns of all up and down the bend there, and just they're amazing, prolific and talented abilities in clay, just amazing, But I just and it just kind of like it sparked something in me, and I think first you can say, why wasn't I taught about this? But none of us had, and there was a man in his 80s, I think late 80s, and he was just thinking, I didn't know this. And so even though I had kind of an inkling of history, like from the workshop, and I had read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and all of these things, it was kind of actually pan-Indians, and yet when we went to Idabel, we started out with the turkey dance, and then we sang the drum dance, then we did the fish dance. And these were things that, Randlett Edmonds and Wimpy Edmonds and the other singers, and there were, I would say there was about less than 10 singers at that point, that gathered. And they, when you go to powwows, well, they weren't singing cattle songs any more than they were like creek stomp dances or all the other neat songs. But, and so when, we were dancing, and I think the next day this one man, his name was Dr. Jim Corbin from Stephen F. Austin University, he gave a ceramics lesson, and he had clay, and each of us got a little bit of clay, and he showed us how to mold it. And
now, was the ceramics lessons like for anybody attending the conference, right? It wasn't targeted for.
It was targeted
Caddo people.
It was targeted for Caddo people.
Oh.
And the other archaeologists weren't there, except the ones who were interested. Well, I guess all of the archaeologists were interested in Caddo life, pottery, customs. They were all artifacts, But Jim Corbin had been studying old ceramics traditions, so he had some of his pots there. And after we started working on this, he showed us a firing, and it was like just right on the ground. It was kind of a little bit rainy, and some of them, popped and broke, and he said, usually this doesn't happen, but it had to be kind of the wet weather. It had to be, I don't know, other conditions, and then. So what I did is I took that knowledge, which wasn't much.
And it was your first experience even working really with clay, wasn't it?
It was the first experience, except when we were making clay dolls on our creek, on our farm. But that was my first experience, and had not. But that's not what I did, because what I was doing at that time in 91 and 92 was I was trying to get a Caddo newspaper started, an independent one, and focusing on information. And I kind of thought we could sell ads, and other people would take up writing, but you know what? Things don't happen that way. And I did have a couple of people who helped me mail, do the mailing, and that was really important, because we had to find the addresses, and I'm surprised they even let us have them. But then, there was nothing going on. Like, I think there was a casino there was bingo at the Wichita Caddo Delaware Reservation, the WCD Reservation in Anadarko. That's where the Riverside Indian School was. So when we started the paper, we sold them an ad, and we did this, and I think we sold 2 or 3 ads, and it paid for it. But that's what I was doing. I wasn't doing clay until 1990, the late 1994, and I had gone through some things, and and I was trying to get my life back, and was I going to go back to teaching? And I thought, but while I'm doing this, I can at least, encourage other women to work with clay. And so I started making pots, and I thought...
In association kind of with the cultural club, or it was your way of encouraging... Okay.
Well, just me. And my idea was that I would just get all these people to... join in. We're gonna really, but I started it, and I thought, well, I'm learning a little bit more, and so I didn't realize there were resources out there. I didn't realize the University of Oklahoma had a major collection, and that they had books that you could actually look, because I didn't
Of Caddo pottery?
Of Caddo pottery.
Oh.
Or, the Red River Museum. So I really just kind of was doing it on, just trying to learn about it. And I didn't know what clay. In fact, I was just using any clay. In fact, I think there was someone at, I'm trying to think where I got this clay, but it was just they said, it's just all the clay thrown together. So that's what I was using. Yeah. Yeah, we don't use this clay. It's kind of extra. So they just kind of mixed it up, and it was for teaching or something like that. So what I did was I invited Dr. Don Wyckoff. He's with that was before the new Sam Noble Museum was built. His office was on North Base, but kind of where the YMCA is now. So, and they were collections, just, it was horrible where they had the collections. Oh. But he invited me over, and we looked at them, and I took pictures, and then, you didn't have instant pictures either. You took a picture, you sent it off, and someone developed it. And there was, the computers weren't there where you could go online and see things. So I didn't have books or anything like that. But he did, and then Lois Albert was his assistant, and they were helpful in sharing that. And then I invited them over for lunch, and I said, look what I've done. And Don said, you need to go to Caddo Conference and show this. It's going to be next month. And it is in Austin. And so Caddo Conference is, let me take a drink of water.
Sure.
Caddo Conference was not for caddos. I mean, okay, not that we weren't welcome, but it was not for caddos. It was for archaeologists who study caddos. And I think it's going to be like anyway, it's coming up soon. And I think it's been over 50 years since that had started. And so when I went down there, I set up my table, which was probably about as you know, just a table, 10 by 4 or something like that. And all of the universities that now owned Caddo Homeland, okay, which is, I call it the 4-state area. It was Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, down in Idabel, down into Texas, down in Louisiana in the swamps, and over into Arkansas. So when I began setting up, they were holding it in Austin this year, okay, and it rotates from state to state, like Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana. Each state will host the Caddo Conference, and this year Oklahoma is hosting it. It's going to be at Gilcrease next month, as a matter of fact. But when I set up, the archaeologists would come by, and they were just fascinated with what I was doing, as crude as it was at that point. And they were buying. And it was, I was sitting, I had a table next to Hester Davis, and she was the state archaeologist, Dr. Hester Davis of Arkansas. And at that time, Dr. Wyckoff was the state archaeologist for Oklahoma. And I got to know all these state archaeologists well, and they're my friends now. But when the Caddo would go by, Caddo people, because we were there dancing, they invited us down, and I took my things so I could dance. They just kind of bypassed it because it wasn't not important at that point. Mm-hmm. And later on, I think it's become very important. And I think at that time, there were no NAGPRA, Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. I don't believe there was that. And so, that really, really gave me heart. So when I came back here, there were 2 ladies who asked me to show them how to make pottery, because they had gone down there. And so I did, and we were right here in my kitchen and on this counter in my table, and I was showing them how to make pottery the way Jim Corbin had been doing it. And at that time I didn't realize there were like other things like temper, like shell temper and bone and this, and I didn't know all of the intricacies. So we were using clay that Jim Corbin had used. In fact, I think he gave me some of the clay. And then other people would call me up and they said, well, why can't we come? I mean, I wasn't charging anything. And I said, well, you can. And so the next week, there were more. And then there were probably about 15 women here, right in this little area. And then the men were in the living room watching. They all were they were all so hungry for something Caddo. And so we moved it we found one of the women's sons had a warehouse that he wasn't using, and it had tables, and so we moved there. And that was really a lot of fun. I think someone even taped it.
So you were still learning yourself.
I was learning,
but the ripple effect was spreading, and they were learning from the beginning.
And it's, I kind of think it's like a mission. Like I was telling you, you have a passion, and people had the passion, but but they didn't. There's the will too. There is that, all the mistakes and what am I doing? Why, so, and then the other thing is that I was thinking about in that time period of going back to teaching, which I did, because, I was just so interested in this, and I thought, well, I can do it on the weekends, but I found out I couldn't. I really, there's an energy that you need. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the energy, the time when you are making, you're being peaceful, or you're gathering yourself to get ready to do something. And I think you need that time of, that downtime. And you need to really, it's kind of precious when you think about it.
So did you and Charles both kind of discuss, I think I'm not going to go back to teaching, I'm going to do this. Let's see if we can do this.
Yes, we did. And but I ended up going back to teaching, and I had formerly taught here in Norman Public Schools, Whittier, and I think I taught there a couple of years, and then I actually got involved with the tribal council and helping out, and I thought, I can't do that, and Charles was working at the Indian Affairs Commission in Oklahoma City, so it was good that I would be able to stop and do something, and then I had. In that period of time in the 80s, I think I taught at Whittier, and then I was a director at Red Earth for 2 years, and then I started this, doing more for the Culture Club, with the Culture Club, because I certainly was not in any way or fashion the leader. I was just like, they'd tell me what to do, and I hoped I could do it. But I was trying to learn the songs, and in listening to some of them, and just doing my very best. But when I went back to school, I went back to teaching. It was as a math teacher in Oklahoma City at Capitol Hill, and which is an inner city school, and with the things that go along, I think that it's probably 98% free lunches. The gang problem, there was probably 50% Mexican. And I'm saying they were from Mexico. They were not Chicanos. They were not Hispanics. They were Mexicans. And one of my, and then there was probably 30% black. And then the rest of them Indian or white. So it was now talk about a calling. I think that was, because I think I taught there for 7 or 8 years, and in that time I really didn't do pottery, and I think I resigned in 2004. I thought I retired, and then I was able to spend more time here, but I really value that experience. I value the people who work there. And I taught algebra, geometry.
So when you pick this up again in 2004, have you solved all the problems of clay and firing? Or are you still experimenting?
I'm still experimenting. And I just would think this and think that. I'll do this, I'll do that. One thing that happened is, like if there's a pueblo, they're all there. Okay. But the Caddos had 4 different states, plus so that made different clays and different styles. And they were considered really great ceramists. They had good clay, but they were masters of working with the clay, and and all of their designs. There were very few of animals. they made effigies, you know, a duck or a turkey, or even a man, but their designs were geometric and swirls and they were it was like a sophisticated type of designs that they used. So I don't know why. And the Caddo were mound builders, so spiral mounds were descendants of those. But there are other mounds all over Caddo territory, ceremonial places, and the one in there's one in Texas, Caddo Mounds. It's when you visit these places, you can see that because they were farmers, and they were also geneticist farmers, because they had different types of beans or pumpkin, but they were able to be able to do that. And because they were farmers and because they were able to do that, then they had time for art, or they had time to embellish things, and that's what they did. And they protected their territories in a way that they didn't go to war, because this is where our territory is. They didn't go to war, but they did do revenge if someone tried to attack them, and they were able to hold and hold that position, hold their land for many years against other forces, and until both disease or other things happened, so that was kind of what their that was their way of looking at life. So their religion at that time was I would say in 1542, when DeSoto came through their country, or our country, and the Caddos were showing him, either paths, or there were guides. When at that time, I think that may have been their first contact with horses. But at that time, their religion was very strong, and was continually strong. And when the Spanish tried to put missions in, they could not. They would not. I was reading just the other day about how this man wrote a letter, and he said, they, at the mission, there's the priest, and they have one soldier, and they haven't had one convert, and no one ever goes there.
Strong.
Yeah. Standing strong, yeah.
So, do you, for your design research, do you go visit different collections? Do you have enough of a repertoire now that you sketch out your designs, I imagine? Is that right?
I do. Yeah, I have enough, and there's the Caddo were prolific, and the pottery, there was a lot of looting at Spiral Mounds. There was a lot of looting, in all of the mounds. So there are collections probably in England and France and Mexico. The University of Texas has an enormous collection. The University of Oklahoma has an enormous collection. In Louisiana, the state, they have in their state museum they have a Caddo display. The University of Arkansas, they also have not just the University of Arkansas, but all the other Henderson, all of the other colleges do too. Stephen F. Austin University. They have it, and it's so I can visit them, but I also have and I have visited all of those states. Natchitoches, Louisiana, they have a wonderful museum, and I have some of my pieces there. I think it's the Corps of Engineers built a visitor center, and they asked me to make some, so I did, and then I have some in the museum. But a lot of them, when the Art Institute of Chicago put together a show called Hero, Hawk, and Open Hand, one of the things was they really wanted the Caddo's permission, and they went around to different tribes, the Creeks or the Choctaws, Chickasaws. But the Caddo collection in there was just amazing. And I was the artist in residence that actually went up there and I was one of the ones, and actually and showed my pottery and had discussion groups, and that was an amazing experience. And so the booklet that went with them, there was a lot of Caddo pottery, and a lot of Caddo pottery. And when they did that show, there are people in the United States who have collections of Caddo pottery, but won't come forward with them because it's probably against the law, or how they retain them. But people are still purchasing them, and they dealing on the black market. It's one of the things, and that I didn't know. I didn't know our pottery was treasured by so many people.
Mm-hmm. How much of your work does involve reconstruction or replication pieces? I'm sorry, and how much is just you working? I rarely do replications anymore. I will do some that I will use a design, and it's probably hard to do that anyway, but I take a lot of liberties with the designs. And I've looked at some of their pieces, and I can't believe the intricacies. And so I'll sketch it out, and I'll try to sketch it out again. But I really try to sketch faithfully what I see, and so if I change it, I know what's changed, and I know, what I have left there. There was a reference in one thing I read to Caddo clay. Have you found a particular? Do you dig your own clay?
I don't dig my own clay, and I just about all that I do right now is a commercial clay, and so I don't fire it like I fire it outdoors. It's wood fired. Mm-hmm. It's kind of my own method, but I think that I'm going to leave that digging the clay and mixing with the shell, which I've done, and I have a few pieces that. Where I, dig the clay. And I have a lot of clay. I have some from the Red River, some from Marshall, Texas, some from Natchitoches, and a lot from Alto, Texas, or Nacogdoches. But, it's almost as if you need to use the same clay, because if you don't, then you are doing a lot of experimentation. Mm-hmm. And I did do that. I've got some shell that I have I burned and then I ground up and mixed with clay, and that becomes and the other thing I've done is mixed it with sand, and I've experimented with bone and also grog. Some of them, and one reason I pretty much use a commercial clay is because I can burnish it where I know how it's going to come out, and so that's kind of the road I'm taking. And I know that there's probably other people who are going to do the all that experimentation, and I know a lot of archaeologists have, mm-hmm. And I know that there are some other people who are replicating Caddo pottery and actually selling it, which is actually against the law if you do that. Mm-hmm. But I know that there are some people and they copy it because those southeastern mm-hmm. artists, they copy it because Caddos had an amazing diversity of clays and designs. I don't think any other southeastern groups had quite that tradition. So I'm lucky.
A lot of your pots are in brown tones, and you know, I'm used to seeing in southeastern, I guess, reds or blacks. Is that a Caddo characteristic, or is that part of your special firing?
It's, you know what, it's part of the Caddo tradition, but it's part of what the way, you know, it's fired. Sometimes usually I will put like a red slip on my pottery and then burnish it, and it is just, you know, that I enjoy doing that, but that's just how it fires. It just doesn't. Some of it is really black, and some of it is really kind of a brownish tone, which I like. You know, I think it's.
I think it's beautiful too.
But the Caddos did have red. They had buff, black, all sorts of brown, and it was kind of hard to get brown because you could, you know, the clay. Sometimes it just wouldn't. It wouldn't fire exactly the way you wanted to, and that's okay. You know, there's always something, you know,
a surprise.
A surprise, yeah.
Have you gotten the lightness that you so admire? Have you gotten that feeling of lightness to your pots?
I have on most of them. That's what I do now, and it's kind of that's what I prefer doing, is trying to make them thin without you know, endangering some, you know,
right,
the firing or whatever. But I do try to make them the same thickness all over except for the bottom, but and that way they are they fire better.
And they're decorative. You haven't done any that you intended to be really functional, or?
Right, they are decorative. Mm-hmm.
I've noticed that Chase Earls is a Caddo potter who's been displaying a very kind of contemporary style pots. Did he attend any of your workshops, or?
No, he didn't. He called me up one day, or he sent me an email, and he said, I'm a Caddo. He said, and I used to live in Santa Fe, and I was making Pueblo pottery. And he said, I thought, so he was going to start, you know, being a potter. And he studied art. So, you know, he was familiar with clay and had gone through the process. And, but he called me up and he said, I'm sure the Caddos, he said, I don't want to be just out there copying them. He said, I'm sure the Caddos have a pottery tradition. And so I said yes. And so he came up here, and I went through my process here, and he knew, he had seen Pueblo pottery fired, and I think he'd read some things. But I shared with him books and people. And I said, well, you know, in a couple of months, we are going to go, is Caddo Conference. So I introduced him to the archaeologist. I said, you need to come to this. And you need to, you know, learn about a lot of the things that they're studying and kind of the whole scope of where the Caddos were. And so he took off. Mm-hmm. But he is really doing, and this is what I think I probably tried, which I didn't really have assistance in. And I think that now there's people, you know, who have more of an idea of how to do, how much you would use shell to clay and those proportions. And I know there was one archaeologist in Arkansas that said he used 50%, and I would use like 20% of shell that I thought was just plenty good enough. So I don't know, but I think that that's probably a research area, and this is hard to do, but I've come to the realization that I'm going to. There's many things that I want to do, but I'm going to do my art the way I do it, because it was hard to say that I was an artist having not studied art and being a community organizer. Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are, but you know, there have been several Native artists, women, who've become passionate, who really found their art or their career later in life after. And I know the practical reasons for that, because your kids are grown and you're not with, you know, taking care of grandkids all the time. But do you think there's a value system that also supports that? A Native value system?
I think there is a value system, and particularly the Caddo tribe, which their line is maternal. It goes through your mother, and they were important in passing on values to the children, and there's always been that. It's in any of the communities that I have observed, whether their line goes through their fathers or whether through their mothers, that there is a sense of order. There's a sense of this is who you are, and I think that is comforting to know that this is in place, and you don't have to wonder. You don't have to be chaotic. Mm-hmm. And the Caddo Festival that I was mentioning is going to be the first weekend in March, and it's going to be at the Oklahoma History Center. But that's a topic that we are talking about is Dee Bigfoot, who is a Caddo elder, and myself, and a few more people are going to talk about the order and the harmony and the traditions that were passed down, that there was a certain way of doing things, and there may be like variations, but this is what you did, and this is when you have a meal, there are certain things that you do, and before you partake of a meal. So yeah, the values and traditions and the order help an individual find that harmony of mind, body, and spirit, which is the title of our festival.
I'll look forward to that.
And in one of the things that we're doing, it's a festival, but we're talking about food, and the meal that we serve is going to be buffalo and squash and pumpkin and beans. Those were our traditions, and corn and nuts and berries. And so we are trying to connect. We are connecting back to our roots and honoring the traditions, particularly the farming traditions that the Caddos had. It was important. Mm-hmm. When we were feeding, we were very prolific about having gardens and farms, and in working together, because I think I grew up with like China and Arapaho, and their dances were like the war dance. There were some, like the round dance, and we also did the owl dance. But the Caddo dances are probably more like Pueblo dances, where we have a leader, and sometimes there's a caller, but all of them are pretty much in order, with the exception, our turkey dance is probably the most ceremonial of our dances, and it is a victory dance. It has been called a scalp dance, but the women dance it, and the lead woman will hold the staff, and those positions are handed down. Mm-hmm. They're inherited, and so the women were very, very important in these dances, in these songs, in the whole community. They made decisions as much as the men.
Well, looking back on your pottery career so far, what's been one of the highlights?
Having a piece that was selected for the Oval Office, I think that is the highlight of my career. And yeah.
Were you at the booth? Were you at a booth at a show when it was selected?
No, I was not. In 2005, because Caddo pottery has been so overlooked, and yet it was so prolific and important, when it was lost, and then when I started bringing it back, the Smithsonian and the archaeologists, they really appreciated what I was doing, especially those archaeologists or the staff at the Smithsonian, particularly those who were studying southeastern tribes, southeastern United States tribes, and so they were having a show. It was going to be in New York City. It was going to be for the opening of the Hay Museum, mm-hmm. and it was, and they contacted me to be a part of that show, along with 7 other artists, and most of the show was of old pottery, but I had a couple of pieces in there, but they purchased them. So when they purchased them, that became part of their collection, and when the Obamas were selecting the art, they chose one of my pieces.
That's wonderful. How about a low point in your career, pottery career? Or
let me think. I think it was realizing I didn't make enough, and I went back to teaching, and now that I look back, I mean, that was really low for me, because I thought I think I can do this, and it didn't happen. So just kind of continuing, but once I began teaching, I truly enjoyed it. But it was very hard, and at my age, it was it was pretty it was difficult, I'll put it that way. But I really met some wonderful people, had wonderful students, and I did my very, very best to do that. I have one story. When the Oklahoma State Legislature passed the law, we're setting higher standards. I was teaching, and in our class, and in the Oklahoma City school system, they said, we are going to get the best teachers, and the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to evaluate Algebra 1. So I went from teaching Algebra 2 and Geometry to teaching Algebra 1. Those were my classes. And I had one class that was called ESL, English as a Second Language. And I didn't speak Spanish, although I'd had some Spanish courses, and they didn't speak English. And these are freshmen. And they learned. And and every day, they would put a problem on the whiteboard, and one of the students he wrote by his name, so and so, then he'd put Guadalajara, and then so every time they would put one up there, they would put where they were from in Mexico, and they were really proud of that fact. And I'm kind of proud of them for, recognizing that they are basically going to be of two nations, because I guess that's what I was,
Right.
It's a Caddo nation, but I'm also United States.
That's a great story. Well, anything else you'd like to add before we look at your pots?
I don't think so. I think I've pretty well... let me add this. I grew up in Colony, Oklahoma, and I told you I had 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and so we were a large family, and I wanted people to know that we didn't like grow up in. We danced the dances, but we didn't. It was difficult, and so we didn't make like our dresses or our clothing, but we'd go to all the dances, and so it's been really fun for us to explore, that part of actually partaking, and I think it connected me to a lot of the Caddo children here in the metro, women and little girls or men, and because they are basically cut off. So we are trying to bring those traditions here.
Yeah, you've just had a huge impact. It's clear. So, well, great.
Okay.
We'll take a look at your work.
Okay.
What would you like to tell us about these, Jerry?
Well, this particular pot is one that is probably a replica of the one that is in the Oval Office. And it belongs to my sister. And the particular design would be from like around Nacogdoches, Texas. And this design on this bowl is one that you would find. It's called Natchitoches engraved, and it would be like Natchitoches, Louisiana, and it's kind of midway between Shreveport and New Orleans. I mean, that's where the town is. Mm-hmm. And this one,
I just wanted to ask one quick question about that beautiful, like cross hatching, and it's so ornate. And I understand Charles has made a couple of special tools for you. You don't have to tell us what they are necessarily, but
I used to use bone, but now to actually do the cross hatching, and that was my tools. I had about 3 that were sharpened, bones, and I'd wrap leather around them. And I also tried to use flint. I was trying to figure what were they using, and probably flint. But then I changed to a more modern tool, and it is steel.
And then the rubbing of the color in, you get that with using a.
I use a brush to rub the color in, and it, and then and the neat thing about that is if I burnish them, when I burnish them with a stone, that the cross hatching will take in all of the clay, and the rest of it will just rub off.
Right, that's really neat.
This is a piece that I made for Red Earth 2 years ago, and I think it won.
Oh yeah.
In the traditional division, but this was a figures that was found on a shell from spiral mounds, and I assume an ornate shell. That I believe that is at the University of Oklahoma. But there are two figures there, and I call them the Hasine twins, because the Caddos had, in their religion, they had a Shanisi who lived or took care of the temple on the mound or the temple in the village, and he would go to a box that held the Kononisi, which were the twins. And there were 2 boys, and he would open up the box, and it would talk to him and tell him what to do. And when the Spanish priest came, he said, "There's nobody in that box. Why are you doing this?" So he would go he went to his church actually and pushed his way in, and opened the box, went past the Shanisi and opened up the box, so there's nothing there. But little realizing that he believed in the Holy Ghost, that no one had ever seen or God. So, at any rate, it was just like such an interesting moment. And so, but I did do this and put, instead of on a shell, I put it on a pot, representing some of the things that I know that this would have been the coon dance, the raccoon, because we have a raccoon dance. And actually, I don't think we do it now, but we did have.
Okay. You want to talk about this piece of
The
it?
tripod is the tripod for the archaeologists we call it friendship engraved, but I named it Tasha because Tasha is the word for friend in Caddo, but it is a fairly good representation of a pot that I saw when I went to a picture of it when I went to the Red River Museum, and but it's very interesting because I think in the Caddo world there's a tripod. There's the sky, and there's the middle, the earth, and then there's the underground, and I do not know if that's what that represents, but I think a tripod is interesting. The other thing about the tripod is that as a math teacher, and you know that when you have 3, it can sit level, or it isn't. If you have 4 legs, there's that possibility of it being a little bit unstable. Which you see, like when people have a campfire, they will put 3 sticks up,
right,
and then hang their pot from under there. That's the most stable.
And that's the most stable.
That's a very
form.
Stable form. And I was talking about the effigies that I see, or that I use. The duck here. Is an effigy. We have the duck dance. Ocean is our duck dance, and in the back one you can see this is probably a very good example of Caddo forms, and on it I did put a dancing turkey, and I call this Nootka Ocean. I actually wrote Nootka Ocean on the back. And Nootka Ocean is our turkey dance. Noot is turkey. And
does that have your signature too? I meant to ask you how you sign your pieces.
I sign them by, okay, here's this one here. I write into it, J.C. Redcorn Caddo. And I haven't actually finished this. But I am, and what I'm going to do is around the pot, around this vessel, I'm going to inscribe the names of our Caddo chiefs. We had a show at the Oklahoma History Center recently, and and they talked about they wrote all of the names of the Caddos here, and so that's what I was going to put on that. I think there was.
Neat.
I will have, when it's finished, Caddo in leadership in the community, Caddo leadership and community.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming.